Hi there. Welcome to Xamarin University and to an introduction to Azure. We're going to look at three primary things today. First, we're going to define some terms and talk about the concepts of cloud computing and specifically how Azure fits into that picture. We're going to look at the services that you can use from Azure when you have an Azure account. And then we're going to look at how to create one of those accounts so that you can get started using Azure yourself. And then we're going to end with a quick tour of the Azure Management Portal where you'll configure and manage these services. So let's start by talking about cloud computing. Cloud computing and the cloud is a common term used to describe data and software services that are stored and running on servers in some remote location from where they're used. Clients, which include web, mobile, and traditional desktop or server computers, then access and use this data and the set of services, most commonly using the internet or some sort of VPN connection. Now, this doesn't sound much different than having your own server somewhere, and in reality it's not. The difference is in who controls and manages the servers where everything is stored and running. And that's the cloud host provider. They pay for and manage all of the equipment and keep it all running and updated, and you just simply use their equipment. So who are these cloud providers? Well, the answer is a lot of companies. There are big companies like Microsoft, Google, Apple, and Amazon that have a lot of resources and products that people use every day. We also have smaller dedicated companies like Dropbox and SugarSync that offer very specific services to clients. And finally, enterprise services companies like VMware that push their commercial products to the cloud to make them more accessible. But why should we be taking advantage of these services offered by these providers? And the answer is, as with anything else, money. Most companies and people need to store data, and the question is, where do you want to store it? To create your own server that's backed up, always available, and kept up to date is quite expensive both in time and money. You've got to have a physical place to put the hardware, pay for the electricity and the cooling, and then have to work out how to get your data onto that server, keep the operating system and tools all updated, and work out a backup plan so that you don't lose your data. And as your data needs get bigger, this gets even more expensive. For example, even though every data center is a little different, the average cost per year to operate a large data center for an enterprise is usually between $10 million and $25 million. That's a lot of money. And so a lot of enterprises have begun to shift toward cloud computing to utilize data centers operated by somebody else where they manage the infrastructure for you, they pay for the electricity, they deal with cooling, they deal with keeping that system online and available 24/7, and we simply push our data up to these servers and use those servers. This saves us both time and money because we don't have to manage any of that infrastructure ourselves. The National Institute of Standards and Technology have defined 5 essential characteristics of cloud computing. The first is that there's broad network access. That means you can reach these resources from a wide selection of devices and systems such as PCs and websites, smartphones, and IoT connected devices. Now, this doesn't mean that the resource is available over the internet. It could fit this definition and be accessible only through a corporate network or a virtual private network. The second characteristic is that it's on demand. The resources are provided on an as-needed or when-needed basis. Consumers of the resources only pay for what they consume, and so you have a pay-as-you-go model. The third characteristic is that the system pools resources. In other words, the provided resources can serve multiple clients or customers with a provisional or scalable sort of model. This is often accomplished through virtualization, but can also be done through higher level management of the provided services themselves. Next, it provides rapid elasticity and expansion. This involves dynamic provisioning of services and on-demand self-services where customers can change their levels of service without actually contacting the service provider. For example, with Azure, some services can actually be automatically scaled by defining rules or thresholds where Azure will check and automatically provide more or less of the resource as needed. Next, and finally, it has to be a measured service. This is where the provider monitors the service for various reasons, including billing, effective use of resources, or overall predictive planning. And they provide this information back to the client so that they can make decisions about how to actually use the provisioned service. And so that brings us to Azure. Azure is Microsoft's application platform for the public cloud, and it follows all the tenets of cloud computing. It's a subscription model, publicly available to anybody who wants to use it, and it supports both infrastructure services, such as computing resources, storage, and networking, and higher level API services, where we could, for example, take a picture of something and have Azure tell us details about that picture. Azure was announced in 2008 and was finally released for production services in 2010. And since then, it's grown dramatically and provided all kinds of APIs. In fact, there are more APIs and services available in Azure than any of the other cloud providers out there. If you look at the stats behind Azure, you'll find some pretty incredible numbers. For example, Microsoft is reporting in 2016 for the first quarter that they've had over 120,000 new customers sign up per month. 1.4 million SQL databases are stored in Azure, and 2 trillion messages per week are processed by Azure. 90% of businesses surveyed plan to increase their cloud spending in 2016, and of those, 42% expect to increase annual spending by as much as 30%. So cloud computing is definitely a thing, and developers need to be aware of exactly what's happening in this space so that they can make sure that their apps take advantage of it. Now, from an Azure perspective, the services that are offered are provided in a set of pillars. And at the very bottom, we have a set of cloud infrastructure services. These are low-level CPU, storage, and networking services that you can use within your app. And typically, these are things where Azure provides some really baseline hardware, and then you layer on top of that the things that you'd actually like to run on that hardware. However, Azure actually has a bunch of things that layer on top of that themselves. For example, you can get a set of analytics. You can also use IoT services. We can get some developer services and platform services that we'll talk about as we go through mobile content. In fact, when we look at the services that are offered, you'll see a massive amount of APIs and specific services that Azure has available. So for example, you can see here that we have compute services where we can actually get raw CPU resources that we might be able to take advantage of. We have app platform services, which are things like web applications and mobile apps that might take advantage of database storage. We have developer services such as Visual Studio in the cloud and a version control system that we can take advantage of. We have media services where we can stream our videos and get a content delivery network that makes sure that our videos are hosted as close as possible to where they're being consumed. We have analytics that are available to us, such as event hubs where we can pass messages and data back and forth. We can watch and monitor our services and see how they're running in real time. We have data services available where we can actually host data in a variety of forms up in the cloud, including a full set of SQL databases. And all of this is offered in a pay-as-you-go model, so you only pay for the things that you actually use and only for the time that you use them. All in all, there are 59 different products available in the Azure cloud as of mid-2016. Now, when we actually break down these services and categorize them, we'll find that we can actually describe them and group them into 3 common computing categories. The first is software as a service. This is the largest and most popular use of cloud computing today, and it's continuing to grow. It's where we replace traditional on-device software with web-based cloud alternatives. Think about consumer apps, software that end consumers directly use based on some sort of subscription model, often accessible with a browser so that we don't need to install client software. Examples are things like collaboration apps such as Gmail or Google Docs, customer relation apps, and online meeting apps like GoToMeeting. Also included in this would be popular file services like Dropbox. The second is infrastructure as a service. This is the lower level infrastructure pieces that you use to build and run your apps. And so computing infrastructure like VMs, file storage, network and load balancing systems, firewalls, things like that. Think data center located off premise. This is often used to host websites or store large amounts of data in databases that you create and maintain. So examples include pretty much any vendor that provides internet-based VM services, such as Amazon EC2, Azure, Rackspace, and Google Compute Engine. And then finally, we have Platform as a Service. This is a layer on top of Infrastructure as a Service, which adds a higher level service on top of the infrastructure itself. This is where the vendor provides you with the entire platform, for example, the operating system, the execution environment, the database, the web server, the host, etc. All that done by the vendor, configured and ready to go so that all you do is layer your application on top of it. Platform Application as a Service is designed to support the complete web application lifecycle, building, testing, deploying, managing, and updating. And can also be higher level service APIs that you consume and use directly within your apps. As an example, machine learning or commercial web services. Platform as a Service allows you to avoid the expense and complexity of buying and managing software licenses because the underlying application infrastructure and middleware, or the development tools and other resources, are all purchased and managed by the cloud vendor. You manage the applications and services that you develop, and the cloud service provider manages everything else. So some examples here include things like Google App Engine and Amazon Web Services, where you build the app and you run it on their platform, which manages the execution of your app. And Azure is the only one that actually crosses all three of these categories today. On the software as a service side, we have Office 365, where we can collaborate online with our coworkers or others. We have Microsoft Dynamics, which is Microsoft's CRM solution, and we have Power BI, which provides interactive data analytics and visualization tools. For infrastructure as a service, this is what most people think of when they think of Azure, because it provides VMs where we can host Linux or Windows and various storage options to hold our data. On the platform as a service side, this is where we have cloud services, which are stateless web VM containers to execute our apps, or analytic platforms where we can build data-driven workflows between our local, cloud, and internet services with data processing logic, or media services used for encoding, content protection, and streaming of AV resources for our applications. These three cloud computing categories tend to be thought of as a set of layers, where software as a service is at the top, platform as a service is in the middle, and infrastructure as a service is at the bottom. If we leverage just infrastructure as a service, we have the most control over the platform and the most management responsibility, because we have to actually install the operating system and manage all the things that are on the virtual machine itself. It's just raw computing resources. With software as a service, we have the least control over the platform and the least management responsibility, because the cloud provider is going to provide all of that for us, and we're simply putting our application on top of it. Microsoft has data centers all over the world. Currently, there are 34 data centers distributed regionally all around the world where you can actually host your services. That means you can pick the region that's closest to where your clients are actually going to be, which gives them the best performance in terms of being able to access the services and data that you need to be able to get to from your applications. You can go to the link shown here on the slide to get a current list of regional data centers, because Microsoft expands these every year to add more regional data centers to be able to provide better redundancy and closer access to the specific data that we want to get to. So what are the benefits to moving to a cloud-based system like Azure? Well, the first one that should be pretty obvious is your maintenance is going to be reduced. Even if you choose the baseline services of just having them manage a VM for you or a physical server for you, you don't have to deal with the hardware maintenance. You don't have to make sure that the hardware stays up. You don't have to maintain a hard drive or a physical server somewhere. You don't have to provide electricity or cooling to it. Microsoft will do all of that. In addition, if you use one of the higher level services such as Platform as a Service or Software as a Service, not only will they manage the hardware for you, they'll manage the software as well. So they'll make sure that hotfixes are applied, and they'll make sure that before they actually spin up a new system with a hotfix applied, that your server actually runs on it so that your application isn't disrupted if they happen to apply that hotfix. You don't have to do any of that. Microsoft will take care of that. Maintenance is included. The second reason is you get better security. Microsoft will make sure that all security patches are applied. They'll manage the firewall for you, and they'll take care of monitoring that system to ensure that there's no intrusions. Third, we get hybrid deployment. So if you're thinking, well, I can't afford to put all my data in the cloud because I have confidential data that I can't allow other systems to hold, that's okay. You can put some things in Azure and keep other things in your corporate infrastructure that you manage and maintain locally. Best, you can even connect these two through private VPN tunnels to allow your infrastructure to hit the Azure services as if they were part of your corporate network. And you can make sure to control that pipeline so that you can secure it effectively to ensure that the Azure systems can't reach into your data center to get a hold of that confidential data. And then finally, Azure has a 99.9% uptime service level agreement. Now obviously you're going to get what you pay for, so the SLA is going to be dependent upon the level of service you decide to subscribe to and how much you're paying for it. Now as you saw, there are a ton of services that you can use. We're going to focus on Azure App Services, and it provides several different application types, each of which is intended to host a specific kind of workload. For example, we have web apps. That's sort of the central part of this, and that allows us to host websites and web applications. We also have mobile apps for hosting mobile app backends, where we can expose data, use authentication services, and support cross-platform push notifications. API apps allow us to host cloud-based APIs in the form of web services, logic apps to automate our business processes, using a workflow sort of orchestration engine, and back-end functions that allow us to write server-side logic to manipulate our server-side databases, reacting to events that are occurring within the cloud. We're going to focus predominantly upon mobile apps as we move forward because we're talking about Xamarin applications. But be aware that you can build these other styles of applications on top of Azure App Services as well, scale them up or out manually or automatically, host them anywhere inside of Microsoft's data center, and get a full SLA to guarantee uptime. From the client perspective, Microsoft provides SDKs to be able to get to pretty much every conceivable client that you'd want to use the service from. For example, we can use .NET, C# or VB.NET or any other .NET language to be able to hit Azure. We can use common web technologies such as Node.js, PHP, and Ruby. Or we can even use native SDKs that sit on top of iOS and Android so that I can use Objective-C, Swift, or Java. So let's talk about what it takes to create an Azure account. It turns out that it's quite easy. You simply go to azure.microsoft.com and you click on the Start Free button. When you sign up, you get $200 in free credit. And what you're really creating here is a 30-day trial. Now, once you create your account and you activate your trial, you'll get $200 to just play with Azure and create some services and try it out. But even after the 30 days, there's a free tier which you can continue to use. It's limited in terms of CPU hours, storage space, and the messages that you can deliver per day, but it is free. And by free, I mean completely free. There's no cost to it. Now, of course, you get what you pay for. Because it's the free tier, there's also no uptime guarantee, and you're low priority and you'll have limited resources. So you'll probably be sitting on a machine that's shared with other people. And you can't use custom domains or SSL connections. But it's great for demos, tests, and doing development on. Now, when you sign up for your free account, you won't have to enter any credit card information. It isn't until you actually start to use some of the paid services that Azure will actually ask you for a credit card. And so this is a completely free trial. You can start up for free without any fear of suddenly being charged for some sort of hidden fee that you were unaware of. So with Azure, as I mentioned before, it's a pay-as-you-go service, meaning you choose what you need and you only pay for the things that you actually use. The system uses per-minute billing, and there's no upfront costs and no termination fees. The pricing tends to be regional based upon the region or data center that you choose and you're hosting your services from, and there are special prices for startups and for academia. In addition, there are discounts for prepaid accounts versus paid as you go. The monthly charges range depending upon the services that you use and the capacity that you need. For example, for app services, These are the application styles we saw earlier, where we create mobile, web, logic, and function apps. It starts at free, where you can have up to 10 apps running on a single shared server with no SLA, which is perfect for testing. Then as you increase the SLA, add storage, or add CPU capacity, the price moves up. For the US Central region, premium service with 8 cores, 14 gigs of RAM, and 500 gigabytes of disk space is about $2.40 an hour, which comes out to about $17.86 per month. This is, of course, in US dollars. Virtual machines vary widely in price depending on what you need, and there's lots of options here with different CPU and RAM combinations and even different types of hard drives, for example SSD versus traditional hard drives. Once you've used your $200 credit, then you'll need to pay for VM space, and it starts at about 0.018 cents per hour for one core with 0.75 gigs of RAM and 20 gigabytes of disk space. That comes out to about $13 a month for a 24/7 VM. At the high end today, we can get a machine with 16 cores, 112 gigabytes of RAM, and 800 gigabytes of hard drive at $1.54 an hour, which comes out to about $13.79 a month. Again, these are US-based central region prices, and so as you change the region or the data center, the price per month will change. Next, we have SQL databases. Again, just like we saw with virtual machines, there's a lot of variance here based upon the performance and the amount of storage that you need. There's actually two different types of databases available. Single databases or isolated databases where you decide the scale, and these start at about $5 a month for 2 gigabytes of storage. At the high end, you can get 1 terabyte of storage capable of processing 350 times the traffic. The second type of database is the elastic model, where you're running in a pool. This is slightly more expensive at the low end, starting at about $150 a month for 10 gigabytes of space and ending up at the $8,370 per month for 750 gig. So you can see that there's quite a range of pricings available to fit every need and budget. Check out the URL on the screen for full pricing details for all the services and offerings available from Azure. Now, if you've got an MSDN subscription, then it turns out that you can actually get monthly credits with Azure. In fact, up to $150 per month depending on your subscription level. In addition, the Dream Spark program also offers free Azure credits. These are granted per month, and any services that you're billed against automatically draw from these credits before you get charged. Now, one of the things you can do in order to predict your monthly cost is to use the Azure pricing calculator. This is a built-in web page that's part of Azure that lets you select the services that you intend to use, and it will give you an average cost to determine exactly how much you're going to pay. One of the other cool things that happens, as you'll see a bit later, is when we use the portal, the system will begin telling us how much money we have left in our account or how much credit we have left in our account as our services are running. So you can get a quick look at exactly how much you've spent at that point in time and how much the system estimates that you're going to spend by the end of the month. The pricing calculator URL is shown here on the screen. Let's take a look at it just to see how it works. So here's the pricing page loaded into a browser. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll find a link here for the pricing calculator. This is actually what you'll want to use to be able to check and see how much something would cost if you decided to build a service on top of Azure. So you can see that it's broken down into different modules here that we can pick. So just as an example, let's start with an app service. Now, once I click this, it's going to actually add that to my pricing calculator, and then I could just start adding other things to it. So for example, my app service is also going to need a SQL database. And perhaps I might also want to add some different networking pieces to it, or maybe I have some additional content that I would like to deliver. Maybe it's videos, maybe it's Xamarin University and we want to sit on top of this. So let's go ahead and encode and store videos as well. And then I also want to go ahead and maintain some identity and authentication. So we'll add an Azure Active Directory. Now, once I've got all the services that I'd like to add in here, I can then click the close button here to actually close this to then see how much this is going to cost. And so you can see I can start to configure this. For example, here I can say my app service is going to be set up. I'm going to go ahead and put it into the North Central US. And I'd like to go ahead and use the standard tier. Notice there's different tiers here, including the free tier. But I'm going to go ahead and use standard tier so that I get an SLA and I have a certain level of support here in terms of the number of cores and how much RAM is allocated and things like that. We'll say we only want one instance, that's fine, and that's going to cost me about $75 a month. I can also add in SSL connections if I want to. In this case, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to add in a database. Let's put it in the same location. We'll again have a single database. Now, notice the database is measured with a term here called DTUs. This is the data throughput unit. This is a measure that the Azure SQL team created to describe the capacity of a particular performance level across a blended measure of CPU, memory, reads, and writes against a database. And so in this particular case, I have a measurement of 5 DTUs with 2 gigabytes of storage per database. And you can see my cost here. As I change my pricing tier, notice my DTU level goes up. This is simply saying that the amount of throughput, or the number of transactions that I could perform per minute, is going to be significantly higher. So notice I can take it all the way up to premium, where I can get 125 DTUs at 500 gigabytes of storage, and you can see that my cost has gone significantly up. Now I'm going to assume that our mobile service is going to predominantly work on the client side, and so we'll retrieve the data once and then we'll work with it in the app. And so we can use a lower pricing tier for that. And we'll have one database. And that keeps us down to $5 a month. Now let's go ahead and configure our media services. So we're going to do video on demand, and we're going to do an encoder. And I'm going to decide how much output we're going to have. Let's just say that we do maybe 200 gigabytes per month. And whether or not we want any indexing on this in terms of minutes. That's going to bring me to a much higher cost here of almost $400 a month that we'll actually be using in order to output our 200 gigabytes of videos. Now maybe we don't really have that much. Maybe it's only 20 gigabytes of output per month. Notice how my pricing is now adjusted. And then finally, we've got our Azure Active Directory. Again, I'm going to put it in the same location here, and we're going to decide our tier. In this particular case, the free tier allows me to have 500,000 objects, and I can do 10 apps per user. We can then decide the features that we'd like to take advantage of, whether or not it's multi-factor authentication, or whether or not we allow for business-to-consumer transactions to be conducted, and then whether or not we support domain services. I don't need those services for this, and so I'm going to leave those off. And so then notice that it tells us what our support options are. And over here I can get my estimate. So at this point, my estimate is, for this simple mobile service that we've allocated here, is $133 a month. And then I can decide, what do I need to tweak in order to get it within the price range that I really am interested in. I can add more items here if I decide, oh, I actually need some additional data or storage. I can also subtract items by removing them from the calculator. So notice by clicking that, it drops my monthly price down. If I decide I actually am going to do my own encoding and upload them to some other provider. So that's the pricing calculator. It's actually pretty convenient to really quickly gauge exactly how much this would cost. And especially if you're using an existing cloud provider that isn't Azure, you can come over here and get a sense of how much it would cost to transfer those assets over to Azure on a monthly basis. As a last step, let's check out the Azure Management Portal just to see how you would actually create services and how you navigate it, because it's a little bit unusual in terms of how it works. The Azure Management Portal is really just a web interface that you can hit from any browser, and it's reachable through the URL portal.azure.com. Now in some cases you might notice that the portal will actually have the words preview on it. That's because Microsoft previews new versions of the portal as they add new features to it. And they'll keep both portals alive at the same time, and you'll have the option to switch back and forth between them. And typically there's a long overlap while both portals are still active. While core services will appear in both portals, not all functionality may be available in both. Newer services may show up only in the newer portal first, and older services and functionality may only exist in the older portal. The message here is that if you don't find something in the older portal, check the newer one and vice versa. So let's check out the portal by actually working with it and creating a service. So here's the Azure Management Portal. I've gone to portal.azure.com and logged in with my credentials. And you can see it places me on something called the dashboard. This is my initial view of all of my services that I have configured, which is very few right now. Now, there are a couple interesting things about the dashboard. First of all, it's extremely configurable. Notice that I have a toolbar that runs across the top here that allows me to create a new dashboard, edit the current dashboard, share this dashboard with colleagues, go full screen, clone the dashboard, in other words, create a copy of this one that I can then edit and make it suit my needs, or delete this dashboard. Let's go ahead and create a new one. This will be called My Dashboard, and notice that I get some tiles here that I can just drag and drop into the system in order to create my dashboard experience. Once I'm done customizing, I can click the button, and now I'm on My Dashboard. And so notice that it has a different view. And I can switch between them by clicking the drop-down arrow and going back to the original dashboard in order to see what my original one looked like. This allows you to create multiple dashboards, each one focusing on a specific service that you want to be able to monitor. Now, one of the other things that we can do with this is we've got a sidebar here on the left-hand side. Notice that it can be collapsed if you need to, in which case we just get icons. I actually prefer to keep it open so that I can see the text. But this is how we actually create new services and resources within Azure itself. And there's a couple different ways we can do it. You can go to a specific category. For instance, I could go to virtual machines here, see all the virtual machines that I have configured, and then click Add in order to create a new virtual machine. Alternatively, I can click back on the Azure logo up here to get back to my dashboard, and I can go to the sidebar and click New. When I use this approach, it's actually going to show me all the different assets that we can create right here as pull-out little sections they call blades. So these little slide-out boxes here are called blades, and they specifically focus on just one aspect that we want to work with. And I can then click the close button in order to move backwards in the hierarchy stack. And so as an example, perhaps I'd like to create a virtual machine. It shows me all the featured apps that are here, and so I could say, well, maybe I'd like to create a virtual machine based on SQL Server. In which case I click this, and it will walk me through the process of actually creating a new virtual machine that has SQL Server pre-installed on it. Now in this case, I'm going to go ahead and close that, and I'm going to back up, and instead I'm going to go to the Marketplace. And so notice this link called the Marketplace. This actually is a much nicer view to show you all the resources if you aren't sure exactly what you're looking for. And so notice here I can create web apps, SQL Server apps, Windows Server apps, mobile apps. I can also come down a little further and even get other third-party services here. For instance, we could create a new Joomla app, or perhaps I want to come down to the very bottom here and create an Ubuntu server. Or maybe I'd like to create a Visual Studio server. And so notice here I can see all the different versions of Visual Studio that we can create. And so perhaps I'd like to try out the new Visual Studio 15 with the Azure SDK. And so let's click this one. Notice that I can select a deployment model here. We have Classic and Resource Manager. Azure originally only had the Classic deployment model, and in that model, each resource you create was independent, so there was no way to group them. Azure added in this idea of resource managers, and the idea is it's just a categorization or a grouping of all of the collected resources that make up a particular service that I'm actually using to be able to provide some sort of support to my clients. And so I can create these resource groups that then allow me to kind of interact with all of the different services that are part of that resource. And so generally speaking, you want to go ahead and use Resource Manager moving forward. And so I'm going to go ahead and click Create. And then it's going to go ahead and walk me through the process. And notice each one just creates a new blade here, but I can always use the scroll bar and still see how I got to this point. And so I'm going to go ahead and give this a name. We'll call it VS15. I'm going to create a particular hard drive type, so we'll just use the regular hard drive. We go ahead and give it a username and a password. And I tell it what subscription level I'd like. Notice it's telling me that I can't use this password because it doesn't meet the criteria. I needed a longer password there. There we go. I can pick my subscription level, and then I can decide the resource group. I'm going to go ahead and create a new one called VS15. Then I'm going to pick a location. I want it to be as close to me as possible. And so I'm going to go ahead and pick South Central US and click OK. Now I can then choose my size. And so notice I have two different particular recommended sizes here, and it has some prices per month. And so it's got D2 standard, which has 2 cores and 7 gig, or A2 standard, which has 2 cores and 3.5 gig. Now I can also go to view all, which is going to give me a lot more choices to pick from. So these were just the recommended versions along with the prices. But notice that I can get all the way upwards of over $1,000 a month with 20 cores and 140 gig of RAM. So it's pretty interesting the level of machines that I can create here. And I can go all the way down to the bottom and even get lower end prices here. So for instance, if I'm really just playing with this, I don't want to spend a lot of money to play with it. And so I'm going to go ahead and just pick A1 Basic, which is 1 core and only just a little bit under 2 gig of RAM. And so let's select that one. Then I'm going to configure some optional features. So I can say how much storage do I want? What sort of network do I want? What subnet is it? All of these things I'm just going to leave as the default settings and click OK. And then I'm going to get a summary page that is, what is the actual validation for this and what am I actually going to create? I'm going to click OK to begin the creation of this virtual machine, and it will go ahead and start submitting that to Azure that will then spin up a new VM, go ahead and lay down a pre-configured image, and then provide access to it. Now that's going to take a few minutes, and so we can simply just watch this as it goes, or we can start playing with other aspects of our dashboard. So while we wait, let's go back to the marketplace and just see what other types of things we can create. Notice there is a search filter up here, so you can type up here if you know kind of what you're looking for. But if I go back in the blades here, I get a list of things that I can actually create for. Now we already saw some of the virtual machines. Virtual machines are kind of interesting. They're essentially just either low-level infrastructure pieces or higher-level platform pieces that already are pre-installed with software. And we've got several interesting ones in here, including different database servers. So notice you can use Oracle, or you can use DB2 or SQL Server. We have BizTalk, we have SharePoint, we have Dynamics. We have other types of security software pre-installed. We have Windows servers here, including the Visual Studio one that we just created, but you could also do WebSphere or just a raw Windows VM. We have some Linux-based VMs here that you can use, including WordPress. We have other business applications that you might want to be able to use. And there are even clustered servers here. So notice that we can actually create a clustered set of servers for SQL Server or SharePoint or one of the other providers that are here. Now, if I go back here, we have other types of things like web and mobile. So for instance, we can create a application that is a web app or a web app plus SQL. I can have a WordPress site that's created and spun up. I can do mobile apps or notification hubs. I can do logic-based applications. I can create blogs. We have different starter web apps, including ones based on PHP or just HTML5. We have all sorts of different containers. So there's Bottle or Docker that's here, and so different types of web apps that we can create. We can also do raw storage containers, and so here we have storage accounts, SQL Server, Azure document databases. Notice there's Redis cache here. We can actually go down a little further and pick up some integration services if we want. We also have some analytics servers, and so we can create analytics servers for searching or for managing the database or data analytics like data lake analytics. There's even some data validation services here. So notice that we can do sales and use tax rates or check phone numbers or verify addresses through existing services that are out there. We've got Internet of Things support, and so different types of Internet of Things applications to be able to connect all of our devices together. We have some networking resources to be able to do VPNs and automatic routing. We have media and CDN, like we talked about earlier, where we can actually create sites or services rather that are designed to be able to do encoding and streaming of our services and geographically locate them close to our clients. We have enterprise integration pieces here to be able to do things like BizTalk. We have security and identity to be able to put identity up in the cloud and to be able to manage our authentication and our authorization. We have developer services. So notice that we have different forms of developer VMs and services that we can actually utilize, such as Application Insights and New Relic. We have business intelligence and cognitive services. This is a relatively new section of Azure, but expect to see this actually flesh out pretty quickly. And then we have containers. And so I mentioned Docker, for example. We have Azure containers and Docker databases. We have different types of other databases available here, including MySQL and Postgres. We have Elasticsearch and WordPress plus MySQL available here, along with Memcached. So other container pieces that we can actually create. All of this available right here from Azure, from the marketplace. So let's go back to our dashboard. Notice that our Visual Studio VM is now up and running. If I click on the block in the dashboard, it'll take me to a dashboard that's specific to this virtual machine. And here I've got a set of properties that I can use to be able to look and see what's happening on this virtual machine, and I have some information related to how to get to this machine. So for instance, here is the public IP address that I would actually use to hit this machine with Remote Desktop. And Remote Desktop has already been enabled, and it's all set up based upon the username and password that we configured the virtual machine with. Now, one of the things that you can do with this is notice that when we hover over one of these things, there's always a context menu, and I can pin some of this to my dashboard. So for example, we can pin this CPU meter to the dashboard that then allows me to see exactly what's happening with this VM. And then I can drag it around to be able to kind of place it exactly where I want. Or I can even configure it with a different size. And so for instance, we could say, let's make this 2x4, or even better, let's make it 4x2, so it kind of stretches across here. And so we can move these things around as part of editing our dashboard experience. And again, this is just one of those things that we can customize pretty extensively with Azure. But let's go back to the VM here, and let's pick up this IP address. If you click on it, notice that you'll get more details about the IP address here, including other settings that are here. I can copy this. If you just hover over it, it'll give you a little copy. Click to copy. And then I can open up Remote Desktop. And so let's go ahead and open up a Remote Desktop connection. And let's connect to this VM. And so we're just connect by IP address. It'll ask me what my password is. I'm going to go ahead and say more choices because I actually want to use a different account here. And we're just going to make it Mark and type in our password that we configured before. And it says it can't verify this, but I'm going to go ahead and allow it to connect. And then notice it's logging me in. And so I'm now in this VM, super easy to create. The VM already has Visual Studio set up, the new version, Visual Studio 15. So this is the next released version of Visual Studio beyond Visual Studio 2015. And it pulls up the server dashboard, which I don't really care about, so I'm going to close this for now. And instead, I'm going to go here to the Start menu, and I'm going to go find Visual Studio Preview, and we'll go ahead and launch it. Now, once the IDE comes up, and it will take a while just because we put it on such a limited machine, we'll have to sign in with our MSDN account. I'm not going to do that, but you can see that it did come up here, and then I have my Visual Studio 15 here. I'm going to go ahead and exit, and then close out this VM. Now, before I close the VM itself, or Remote Desktop out, I'm going to go ahead and shut the VM down, just so that I don't incur any additional costs. And so I'm going to right-click and say Shut Down, to make sure that the VM machine itself is shut down, and I'm not incurring any particular cost for the VM to run, because you pay for CPU minutes. So that's an important thing to remember when you're dealing with these VMs. If you don't want to be charged for them, then go ahead and make sure to shut it down. Now I'm back in my Azure portal here. I can click on the portal to get back to my dashboard. And now, if we actually went over here to virtual machines, I'd actually find that I do have a virtual machine here. And so this again allows me to find my virtual machines. In the same way, I can also go to resources and see all the resources that we have allocated. So notice that there's a bunch of resources that are related to that virtual machine. And I can go to resource groups, because I defined a resource group called VS15 that is all of those resources collected together. And so once I'm finished with it, I can come here and I can delete this resource group by typing in the name of it, VS15, hitting delete. It'll ask me why I want to delete it. I was just trying it out, so I'm okay with that. We just submit our feedback. And then it will go through and delete each one of those things that was created in order to support that virtual machine. So this is one of the reasons why we want to use resource groups over Classic. Is with Classic, I'd have to go and delete each one of those things individually. With resource groups, I can actually get it to delete all of them together by maintaining a relationship between them. Then I'm going to go ahead and get rid of them off of my dashboard. So I'm going to go ahead and close that, and then I'm back to my regular dashboard view. And eventually these will disappear as well, simply because they're still in the process of being deleted. The management portal is a convenient and easy way to configure and work with Azure services. However, it's not the only way. Azure actually has a full set of public web services which you can program against. You can get the link in your Start Here that comes with the materials. You can also install a command line interface which provides a CLI front end to those web services, and you can perform most administrative tasks right from the command line. It supports Linux, Mac OS, and Windows, or you can install it in Docker if you prefer. The install link is in the Start Here page as well. Finally, another exploration technique you can use with Azure is to use one of the quick starts. The marketplace includes a mobile app quick start, which creates an example to-do mobile application backend, along with a SQLite database and a client front end built using iOS, Android, or Xamarin, or Windows. And you can download those clients to interact with your backend to be able to just explore how the service works. This is a pretty cool way to just learn how to program against the backend. So let's take a look at that really quickly before we end. Now, as a last step, we want to go ahead and create a new mobile app using the quick start. I'm going to go back to the marketplace, see all, and here in my filter, I'm just going to type quick start. And notice that I have two quick starts available to me. One of them is mobile apps quick start. I'm going to choose this one and then click the mobile app quick start when it comes up. That'll open up a new blade here, which just tells me about what we're going to create. I'm going to click the create button, where it'll again open up some property blades. So the first property blade is to actually define the name of the app. The name of the app has to be globally unique because it's going to define the DNS address that will actually represent this application on the internet. And so we'll call it My Task List. And it'll be My Task List AzureWebsites.net, except that is taken, so we'll do My Task List 1. That is also taken. Let's try 20. Ha, that one works. So mytasklist20.azurewebsites.net will be the name of our site. Again, I'm going to pick my subscription level. So if you've got multiple subscriptions, then they'll show up here. I'm going to pick my Visual Studio Enterprise subscription, and I'm going to create a new resource group. So we'll call it Tasky, and I'm going to define where I want this to be. So notice that I already have an app service plan location that's in South Central US. But if I didn't, I could create a new one. I give it a name. I select the place where I want it to be, and I select my pricing tier. So the location and the pricing tier are sort of bundled together as part of this to decide exactly how much this is going to cost, because remember, that's relevant to the region itself. And so we'll go ahead and use the existing app service plan that's there, and I can check this box to say pin this new created resource to the dashboard. I'm going to go ahead and click Create. That'll submit the deployment again, just like it did for the VM, and it will begin deploying that mobile app. At some point, that deployment will finish, and we'll end up on the dashboard here. Now, notice the dashboard for the Quick Start looks a little bit different. It's simplified specifically because they assume this is a starting point for people who are unfamiliar with mobile apps and with Azure in general. And so I've got a couple of things I can do here. I can see my app that's running, and again, we can dock all this to the dashboard if we want. So if I pin this to the dashboard, it would stick it on my main dashboard. I can go read the documentation, and then I can set up some features. So there's 3 features that are available here. Easy Tables is a quick and easy database. Authentication allows me to then authenticate a user based upon some third-party OAuth representation. So against, say, for instance, Google or a Microsoft set of credentials or something like that. We can also do Easy APIs, which is an easy way to set up basic web services to your service so that your mobile app has some custom logic that can be executed in the cloud. And then we've got some tools down here to be able to edit the site code, to be able to look at our diagnostic logs, and to be able to see the runtime IIS logs. All this is hosted in IIS, as you'll see when you take the next course. But what we're going to do is click the Client Apps box. That will open up the Quick Start for the client apps. And what this is going to do, and so notice that I just got my delete resource group notification here. So that finally finished, is I can then download a specific app here that's tied to this backend service. I'm going to go ahead and pick the Xamarin Forms app. And then notice it says I have a data connection. However, it's based on SQLite and it's not recommended for production use. And so this is strictly a test sample application. It's not intended for you to use this in production. The model that it's created doesn't really use any particular resources in the cloud beyond the service itself. The SQLite is just a light database. And so they don't really want you to use this for production purposes. We have a table. I can then create a new app, or I can connect an existing app and it will tell me the basic steps, 3 little bits of code that we'd have to add into an existing app. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a new app and say download. I'm going to save it. I'm going to open it. And so notice here's my application itself. I want to make sure to extract this. And then we can open this in Visual Studio. Now, because the portal created the app for me, it's already going to be configured to talk to this backend service that it generated. And so I'm going to have this app, and it's just going to be a standard Xamarin Forms application that has our PCL library with all of our core logic. So this is where our screens are defined. And then, of course, platform projects for Android, iOS, Windows 8.1, and Windows Phone 8.1. Now, what's missing here is UWP, so that's not in this list here, interestingly enough. But you could add a UWP app as well. And, of course, you could do File New Xamarin Forms app and then just add the logic from the portal that was displayed there. So let's go ahead and rebuild this. Let's restore our NuGet packages first, just to make sure everything's all set up. And then let's go ahead and rebuild this. I don't have my Mac host available, so I'm just going to cancel that. And then let's go ahead and run the Windows version. So I'm going to make this my startup, put it on my local machine, and click Run. It'll launch, and it'll talk to my Azure app. So I'm going to say, this is a task list, get the milk. Say add, and then notice I have a get the milk item here. And I can mark that as completed. I can also come in here and say, maybe I need to clean the garage. Add, and now I have a clean the garage. Now the interesting thing is this is interacting with a server-side database. And so as I add these tasks, it's going into a server-side database, which means that it's persistent. So if I close the app, and then I relaunch it, we should see our data still here. And here's our clean the garage. So it's not being stored here in my local list. It's actually being stored up in the cloud and all being managed by that backend app that we created with Azure. And you can walk through all this code and figure out and look and see exactly what all the API pieces are. But instead, I'm going to recommend that you take the next 2 classes in this course, which are Azure110, that covers the server-side component for both Node.js and ASP.NET, and Azure115, which is the client side that we're looking at here, that covers how to actually interact and control all these different services, including adding and updating and deleting items from the cloud. And so that's the basics of the application that's been created here. Now you've seen the 30,000-foot view of Azure and some of the services that it supports. In the next set of classes that we offer in the Azure track as part of Xamarin University, we'll dive deeper into the server side of building a mobile app backend, and then into the client side to actually consume that backend, so that you'll see how all those pieces fit together and how you can actually tailor it to do exactly what you want. Thank you for watching this video on an introduction to Azure, and thank you for being a Xamarin University subscriber.